In this tutorial, we are going to explore the data panel of the Sketch.io platform to integrate data in our project and build a dynamic website or web app. This tutorial is a little more complex than the previous ones, so you might need to go through it a few times to make sure that you catch all the subtleties. Before we get started, we need to define the data model that will hold our data. A data model contains a list of fields so that each entry in our database will define the values of these fields. This basically corresponds to the structure of our data model. As an example, we are going to create a data model in our project that will hold the different card elements in our page. We give it a name and a handle. And we can start adding fields to our data model. The first field is going to be the category of the card. This field will hold the information as to what kind of card this is. We can set this field to be a drop-down field so that if we want to add a form to edit or create a card entry, the category field will be a drop-down menu of options. The options we are going to provide are animal, object, and let's say color. For the default value, we can use animal and set this field as a required field in our data model. Now we can add another field to our data model. It will be the name field corresponding to the card name. It will be a text field. Then we add a description field. And finally, we would like to add a field for our image. The image field will hold the URL of the image. Great, now that we have created our data model, we can save the project so that it gets created. We can now start adding data to our card data model. So go back to our list of data models and click on the eye icon to view the entries in our card data model. As you can see, we currently have no entries in our database, so we can start adding entries manually like this. Now that we have created our data model, we would like to populate our web page with the data we have just created. This can be done in two steps. The first one is that when the page loads, we need to retrieve the data entries and store them in a variable. And the second step is to fill our page with that data. To retrieve the data, we need to open the page controller panel available here. The page controller uses Sketch's block programming tool to create complex workflows. The page controller blocks run on Sketch's servers before the page loads. Our starting point is the page setup block. This is the first module of our workflow, and the next module that will be executed will be determined by the next module connection. To add a new module to our workflow, we simply need to click on the plus icon here or right-click and selecting the module we want to add. Modules are organized in these folders to make it easier to find them. We recommend you to explore the different modules that are available to get more insights on the different things you can achieve with them. In our case, we would like to retrieve entries from our database, so we go to the database folder and choose Data Retriever. Right now, the module is not executed when the page loads, and that is because it is not connected to the page setup flow yet. So we connect them like this. We still have to configure the Data Retriever module to tell it which data we want to retrieve from the database. So we can click on the configuration icon to open the configuration window of the Data Retriever module. First, we need to choose which data model we want to get our data from. So we select the card data model. And then we need to filter which entries we want to retrieve. You could, for example, filter only animal entries if you want. You can create complex filters to only retrieve the entries from the database that match some specific criteria you want. For us, we will keep it open and carry all entries in the database. Once the data retriever module gets executed, we will have access to the entries array node that will hold the data entries. Right now it is not fed anywhere, so what we need to do is to store the information in a variable with the setVariable module. We connect the module to our workflow and connect the entries array output into the value input. We also need to give a name for our variable. We can name it cards. Great, we have modified the page to retrieve the card information from the database and store it in the cards variable. What we need to do now is to populate the page with that information. In the previous tutorial, we have exposed some properties of the card component to be able to modify it outside of the component. What we are going to do now is to change that, and instead we are going to link these properties to a variable. So we double click on a card element, and for each property we have previously added to the component's properties, we are going to remove it and instead link it to a variable. For the name field, we need to extract the name field from the entry variable. If you recall, when we have added a name field to our data model, the handle of that field was simply name. So we want to link the content property of this element with the entry.name variable. So we need to do that with all the properties of our card component. Great, now we have a card component that renders using the entry variable. What we need to do now is to feed the cards variable that we have previously set into the card component. For that, we can use the block loop element and configure it this way. The data array is our cards variable. You can think of it as a list of entries, and the block loop will loop through this list and render one card component for each entry in our list. We set the component to the card component. It is also important to set the loop variable as entry. This must match the variable that we have used when configuring the card component's dynamic properties. We're almost done now. We just need to remove the card components that we had previously, since our card components will be rendered automatically by the block loop element. We can save our project and preview it to see the final result. So we can see that it works perfectly. When the page loads, the data is retrieved from the database, and then it is fed into the block loop element that renders each entry as a card component. This is awesome, but let's take this a step further. Right now, we have seen how to retrieve information from the database and display it in our page. But what if we want to allow a user to add new cards to our page? There are several ways to achieve that, but the simplest one is to add an entry creator form to our page. So we drag it right here, and we can head to the properties of the form element we have just added. We simply need to select the data model the form will affect, and leave the other options the way they are. We can also slightly adjust the design of the form and save the project. Now when we go to the preview, we can see that the form was added to the page and that it allows us to add new entries to the database. We can add a new card now. And hit the save button. And here we go, the new card was added to our database. This tutorial contained a lot of material, and so we encourage you to go back and watch the parts that you felt were more tricky. We also always recommend learning by trying. Get your hands dirty by making test projects. Using data models with Sketch will also be covered in future tutorials, so stay tuned. In the next tutorial, we're going to see how to use actions to create interactive apps.